On October 12, 1964, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev received a call at his dacha on the Black Sea. The Politburo was meeting to settle a nasty dispute over agricultural policy. Would he be willing to return to Moscow to oversee it? An official plane was being dispatched to take him back to the capital. Khrushchev might have suspected he was walking into a trap. Although he'd been one of Stalin's most ruthless henchmen, he'd spent his premiership tearing down his mentor's legacy. He'd released millions of political prisoners, relaxed censorship, and adopted a policy of greater cultural openness. These moves won him popular support while causing profound discomfort among Soviet political elites. Suddenly, former allies became bitter opponents. Khrushchev had long since given them the rope they needed to hang him. His leadership style was chaotic and bullying, his brashly threatening public manner a constant source of embarrassment. In one famous episode, he became so unhinged during a debate at the United Nations that he took off one of his shoes and pounded it on his desk, much to the amazement of the other world leaders in attendance. And his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis had been nothing short of a national humiliation. When he arrived at the Kremlin, Khrushchev was informed he'd be facing a 29-count indictment, charging him with mismanagement, incompetence, and professional arrogance. He wasn't particularly shocked. After all, his enemies had repeatedly tried to depose him, and they'd always failed. But this time it would be different. His power base was gone, his threats of retribution empty. Khrushchev was forced into retirement. The state-controlled media said he'd resigned due to age and ill health. Deeply depressed, he lived the final 7 years of his life under house arrest in Moscow, relegated to the status of a non-person. The government denounced his policies without ever mentioning his name. His replacement was Leonid Brezhnev, a former protege who brought a degree of stability to Soviet foreign and domestic policy. A much smoother political operator, Brezhnev curtailed many of Khrushchev's reforms and solidified his position by establishing a spoils system for the benefit of his cronies. These corrupt bureaucrats maintained a dull, grinding status quo, frustrating any progressive initiative. Bit by bit, an aura of stagnation settled over the Soviet Union, an atmosphere that decisively influenced the work of Dmitri Shostakovich during his final years. By 1970, Shostakovich's health had been deteriorating for more than a decade. Initial symptoms of weakness and pain in his right hand had marked the beginning of a cascade that would include long hospital stays, chronic pain, multiple heart attacks and strokes, diagnoses of polio, ALS, and finally, lung cancer. Now in his mid-60s, his musical output had begun to slow. The elements of bleakness and despair that had previously been a feature of Shostakovich's music became a consistent, defining presence. And in this sense, the 15th Symphony represents the final stage of this creative evolution. He began sketching the piece in April 1971, finishing it 4 months later at a Soviet Composers Union retreat in the St. Petersburg countryside. Although his mind was as sharp as ever, his trembling, painful hands made putting his ideas on paper extremely difficult, and the sparse textures that dominate this purely instrumental work are a likely consequence. He hadn't written a symphony without a literary narrative since his 10th, a piece completed 20 years earlier. Nonetheless, he filled the 15th with material that clearly suggests an autobiographical intent. While it's unclear whether Shostakovich believed the 15th would be his symphonic swan song, he certainly knew he was living on borrowed time when he composed it. This makes his decision to quote so extensively from works by other composers particularly intriguing. He appears to have assembled a collection of his favorite musical objects to create a personal valedictory. These quotes cover such a wide range that their appearance seems random. They include the Lone Ranger theme from Rossini's William Tell Overture, references to Wagner's Tristan and Isolde and the Twilight of the Gods, Glinka's vocal elegy to Lost Hopes, Do Not Tempt Me, and the invasion theme from Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony. He explained their presence in his typical enigmatic way, saying, "I don't quite know why the quotations are there, but I could not include them." Other aspects of the piece are more conventional. The slow, desolate laments in the second movement, the biting sarcasm of the scherzo, and the catastrophic climaxes in the second and fourth movements are all familiar signatures of Shostakovich's music. Even when the musical language is abstract, it's deployed for poetic purposes. Discrete passages of 12-tone writing alternately convey chaos and anguish, while isolated tone clusters suggest an arid, toxic landscape. Especially poignant is the simulation of a ticking clock he draws from an expanded percussion section. It appears briefly at the end of the scherzo, and then again in the finale's extended coda, where it floats above a barren string chord that recalls the opening of Mahler's First Symphony. After a final spasm, the ticking fades away, the empty chord appearing to be all that remains. Then, in a parting gesture of reconciliation, a high C sharp is gently sounded, completing the harmony and bringing Shostakovich's symphonic legacy to a close.